Welcome back, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed the proceedings of this afternoon. I take on board entirely the comments of some of you who complained that it was very difficult to choose between the sessions, and that some of you wanted to listen into all three. I absolutely take that on board. If anything, it's an affirmation, if I may take it from my point of view, it's an affirmation that this conference has been successful to an extent, and particularly to the extent of choosing the topics and the themes. I'm also overwhelmed by the, till now, at least with me, and then I'll collate everything with my stewards, but till now, a 100% feedback that the sessions, the themes, the organization, and first and foremost, the speakers chosen for each and every panel have all received a resounding acknowledgement and your appreciation, and that is, to be honest, that is the most important element of this conference. I now move to the final session. We are aiming to end by 5, just after 5, maybe a few minutes after 5, and hopefully in the last session we'll try to an extent to sort of bring together most of the ideas of today. On your schedules, the moderator should have been Peter O'Bourne, whom I am not. He's far taller and far hairier than I am. Peter came and joined us for the morning session and had to run off, and just half an hour ago sent us an apology by text saying that he'd been called to write an article for tomorrow, but he sent his apologies and also his acknowledgement of the conference. So you have the misfortune of having me as your moderator for the last session, which I'll try to run through as smoothly as possible. It gives me great pleasure to actually do this, because I never tire of introducing our closing keynote speaker. Professor John Esposito is a university professor as well as a professor of religion and international affairs and of Islamic studies at Georgetown University in the United States of America. He's founding director of the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding in the Walsh School of Foreign Service. He served as a consultant to the US Department of State and other agencies, European and Asian governments and corporations, universities and the media worldwide. A former president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America and of the American Council for the Study of Islamic Studies, vice chair of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, and member of the World Economic Forum's Council of 100 Leaders. He is a member of the EC European Network of Experts on De-Radicalization and the board of C1 World Dialogue, and an ambassador for the UN Alliance of Civilizations. Professor John Esposito is going to talk to us for about 15 to 20 minutes on the future of political Islam, democracy, militant jihadist, and the war on terrorism. Please welcome Professor John Esposito.
I'll also be discussing Italian cuisine and doing all of that in 15 minutes. Let me just explain something. I gave a presentation a little earlier, which actually would fit in terms of the theme for me to speak, but I'm not going to repeat that because some of you were there earlier and because we don't have time. That's one. Number two, I initially had a sense of a longer time slot, not that I need that. I go home very soon and I can't wait to do that. But that means that I'm going to be looking down rather than up, much more than I usually do, to try to whip through and at least make some of the points that I want to make. It seems to me that today a major issue is whether in the 21st century, whether it will be marked by the preservation of an old order or the restoration of an old order, i.e. authoritarianism, i.e. the tendency of Western powers to support authoritarian allies, seeing them not as people that they really love their form of government, but because their securitization assures stability and meets their national interests. That was threatened very much, of course, by the Arab uprisings and by the movement of both the U.S. and the EU, after a period of equivocation, to actually recognize and work with the Islamists who were elected. On the other hand, the allies, authoritarian allies, their military, and others during that period were clearly protesting and lobbying just the opposite. What have you done? You sold out your friends, but also you've got a problem in that states will not be as secure. That will affect stability. And so we then saw with the situation of Egypt, and here I'm just going to use Egypt as the example, we see something that is a coup, but people aren't really sure if it's a coup. And we also see something that at times does things that we are concerned about. We don't necessarily approve, but we don't robustly condemn. And so after a while, we continue to then recognize the coup and an authoritarian government that, in coming to power, engaged in what international media and human rights groups have acknowledged, engaged in massacres at Rabat, widespread arrests, torture, and the rest goes on and on. Okay. So if that's the case, then now where do we go from here? Can we see this as, like, as I said earlier, can we draw a conclusion that, well, this signals the kind of permanent sort of death of any idea that there can be democratization in the Arab and Muslim world, or that there's, with regard to Islamic movements, that they will be able to participate in mainstream politics and rather than simply being marginalized, especially at a time when we have the list put out by the UAE, but also some other Gulf states to support that not only say that, let's say, an ISIS is a terrorist, but that in fact says not only is the Muslim Brotherhood terrorist, but anything that's a kind of affiliate, a lookalike, etc., which therefore means pretty much snuffing out or providing a rationale for limiting what in the Gulf is often the kind of limited opposition that is constituted by elected Islamists. And so as we look forward, is there a possibility of rather saying that in fact this is a stalled stage as we move to democratization? Speakers earlier, and since you were in different sessions, you may not have heard, but one or two speakers talked about the fact that if we look at the reality of revolutions and then, if you will, the emergence of democracies, that often, some said decades, it's centuries in terms of whether or not the visions of those revolutions, took place. And if I think of the American Revolution was followed by a civil war in which far more people were killed and the Union was threatened. And the very things that we see and privilege as being at the heart of what America stands for, freedoms and equality, did not hold true, not just for African Americans, but for women, and it wasn't that it was realized in decades. And it's not even that it's sort of totally, fully realized now. And we're still prone, having recognized and addressed the equality of people of certain religious backgrounds and ethnic groups, not recognizing it with new ethnic and religious groups. So we don't want to think, therefore, that if there's a process of democratization, that process is necessarily dead, and that process may not and will not come back, especially when you look at major polling that occurred before, and some after, but it's more difficult, but major polling that actually showed by Pew and Gallup, and I should mention I used to be associated with Gallup, that showed that majorities in the Muslim world wanted democratization. Okay, wanted rule of law, etc. Some of that polling doesn't go on now, simply because, for example, in the case of one major polling group, the Gallup organization, which set up a center in the Gulf and did great work, and its mandate was to really focus on and get the Gulfy opinion, when, of course, the Arab Spring came and then the fear of it spread, then, in fact, the very people that sponsored that creation weren't exactly going to be wanting to see polls coming out of, let's say, in Egypt or Tunisia, let alone polls coming out from within their own countries or being taken that could reinforce what they feared. That is that if you will, that people would not so much see the movements in Egypt and Tunisia as coming there, but that the ideas would reinforce what, in fact, the hopes and aspirations of certain elements in their own population wanted. So as we go forward, then the question is, can or will institutions of power be redefined or be replaced? Can the culture and values of authoritarianism be transformed into culture and values of democratization? And I think this is really important. Connected with that is the notion of loyal opposition. Someone made the point earlier, and I would just want to tease it out a bit. I usually speak fast, but I'm speaking even faster, but that's okay. It means we get out faster. You get to pray, I go for a martini. But anyway, if my wife were here after, she'd say, I don't believe you say things like that. But I do it because then I call her later and she said, how did it go? And I give her some of my more rich quotes. But, the reality that we have to look at is that if you have a culture and values of authoritarianism, then even the people that come in are going to react a certain way. So on the one hand, people were concerned, many of the activists, and I said that in an earlier thing, in a meeting that we had in Istanbul after the uprisings, they were concerned about two things, however different. The deep state, and saying that they're really, in some ways, the deep state is usually done away with in some of the great revolutions. That is, people get killed, they get imprisoned, they flee. But in fact, you've got a deep state. And then also, where would the US be coming from? But the other side of it is, if you have and have grown up in a culture, then you're going to react the same way often, in an indiscriminate way. I was once asked to chair the meeting of the Sudanese Studies Association, which used to alternate between Sudan and the UK, but they came to the US. My colleague John Vole, who's a Sudan expert, knew exactly what he was doing. Instead of his chairing, he had me chair it. So I thought, what a great honor. And in that session, you had the following discourse. Sudanese come together. It looks like, for the outsider, okay, they all come from the same country. This is an academic. All of a sudden, everything breaks out because you have leftists, secularists, Marxists saying, look at what you Islamists have done to us. We're put in prison. But 20 minutes later, they're saying, and when we get in power, you're all going in, Or the situation I had 20 years ago in a North African country, often seen as, more open, et cetera, so, not quite like Algeria, et cetera. And it's not quite Tunisia that I'm talking about. And the human rights person, who was the human rights person and also working at the UN, talked about human rights with me. And at one point, she said something about, I was doing work on Islamism in the region, and she said, well, they ought to be put into prison. So I said, well, you mean this group in this country? She said, yeah, but they should be. I said, well, what's the they? She said, all of them. And the key should be thrown away. Now, this is after a long conversation with somebody who had very enlightened notions on human rights, until you got to the exception to that. Of course, you see that in Egypt, when many of our more liberal intellectuals and liberal friends wound up supporting what went on, and even when confronted in conversations where you would say, okay, I know you think that the Islamists are bad and what they're going to do, but in terms of, if you looked at body count, torture, arrests, the massacres at Rabaa, how do you deal? Oh no, that was really bad, but. So you put it aside and somehow you don't work through it, okay. All right. Now, some of the points that my colleagues and I make in a book that we've done, which is not available, so I'm not plugging it, okay? But I can tell you, around Christmas and Hanukkah time, it makes the ideal gift. It should be coming out around that. I'm talking to the publisher about that. If you're a Buddhist, I can give you a comparable day to celebrate. But one of the points that we make is the following. Political battles are no longer simply between advocates of a religious state and supporters of a secular state. That's always the easy way. It's the Islamist and it's the secularist, and it's that. In fact, the struggles are and will be between populist participatory democracy, on the one hand, whether Islamic or secular, and on authoritarian, elite-guided democracy, whether Islamic or secular. And when we say elite-guided democracy, we don't really mean all that democratic. We had a big debate among the authors about, I don't like talking about using guided, but the dictionary says that it's okay the way we're using it. For me, when you say guided and you also say it's authoritarian. But we got to break down the old kind of category, because if you actually look at, for example, Egypt again, you see that broken out in terms of when people lined up in oppositional work together, it wasn't a kind of standard where you could say, well, it's secular versus religious. Just as really, it's not a matter, therefore, of simply being movements, whether it's elite secularist and Islamist movements that are fighting each other or are going to advocate putting an ideology. It's government that will do it. Sisi uses Islam. He makes the point, as Sadat did, of being seen praying, of citing the Quran. He makes the point of calling for an Islamic Reformation. I get reporters call me up, and when they go to talk about it, what do they wind up saying? Well, we know Islam needs a reformation because, and then I'm waiting for some sort of, some of the people that I wrote about in my book, Future of Islam, which is available on Amazon. I'm only kidding when I do this. I don't expect you to help me pay for my house and my children. I don't have kids, but anyway, it works with people if you talk about children. But the reality of it is, it wasn't. He cited Sisi. He said, here you have Sisi and Al-Azhar, both agreeing that Islam needs an Islamic Reformation. It needs a reformation. And they're the target. Sisi has the credentials now, because he's not only going to use it at home, it plays out well. Both democratic and authoritarian secularists are out there, but also democratic and authoritarian Islamists. Okay? We usually acknowledge the latter, but not the former. In this new context, though, it's very interesting about the future of democracy to look at 8 countries, which I'm not going to do now, but just listen to their names. Senegal, which is democracy. Indonesia at the other end. People don't talk about it enough. Then Tunisia. Egypt, which is not. Turkey, Pakistan, and Iran. Okay. Many of these governments have, in one form or another, not democracies, but clearly have put in place, some have become democracies or pretty close to it, and others have put in place institutions, and institutions which allow for enough participation that one can see building on it. So it's not as if even in the past we haven't had that. Also, if you actually look at history from the 19th century on, from the late Ottoman period, and in Iran, you had movements, constitutional movements that attempted not to bring in democracies, but to limit the power of the government, to try to assure more of a sense of rule of law, etc. Okay, I've got to go really fast here. Okay. With regard to Islamists, beware of political exclusion, and some people have made that point before. If we look at the rise of ISIS, a power vacuum has enabled separatist movements, particularly ISIS, to garner supporters, take advantage of the increased accessibility of large-scale weaponry, seize and hold and govern large swaths of territory, which is their goal, and never Al-Qaeda's. Al-Qaeda talked about a caliphate in the far future. Their approach is to take and seize power, and to attract large sums of money, to continue as others did. But to fight either in terms of, if you look at their websites and technology and the way they can advertise and lure people, to use not only the latest technology, but the latest, sort of website building and almost, attractive game, images, only now replacing it, with the triumphant armies, of ISIS. They've been able to trade off the chaos in the region, but they've also been able to trade off the failure of Western governments to sufficiently respond to the underlying grievances that cause these problems. I mean, the reality of it today is that it's not a matter, and I said it earlier, of simply getting religious leaders to sign off on something, of bringing together some Muslim governments to make statements, of Western governments to make statements, and then of sending in, let's say, armies and drones and just figuring we'll blow them to smithereens, because if we don't go with the root causes, there will be a successor to ISIS. I mean, there will, you know. I remember, I'm old enough to remember when people thought with Khomeini that when he lost the Iraq war and you had to swallow the bitter pill, that that was going to discredit and somehow affect the development. Then when he died, of course, that was definite. You know, Dracula had had the spike put through him and was never going to come back again. And so that was going to, kill the movement. And then later on, when people would talk about Al-Qaeda, it would be, well, you know, if that goes away and we begin to say, well, they're breaking apart, and then it was almost as not only can they not resurrect themselves, but the idea that if they broke apart, that would end so-called the threat of global terrorism. And here we are looking at ISIS. Unless we deal with those deep-seated grievances, but dealing with those grievances, of course, are also going to mention that Western governments have to deal with their foreign policies, and their foreign policies that have to do with support for authoritarian allies, that Western governments have to, rethink the way in which they understand Islamist movements. I mean, the simple fact of it is that Western governments have always been ambivalent about movements. When Jihadist during Bush 41, that's the first President Bush, it took me 2 years to realize what Bush 41 and Bush 43 meant. Now that I know it, I feel like I sound sophisticated. I'd always raise my hand and say, what does it mean? What does 41 and 43 mean? You know? So, okay. So when the first President Bush had what then was a statement made by Jihadist saying the U.S. was willing to look at democratic elections and let any and all players, including Islamists, okay, as long as they didn't believe in one man, et cetera. Jihadist admitted later on they put a policy in place. We do this often. It looks like it's groundbreaking without thinking, suppose we had to implement it. And in fact, with Algeria, we backed off. At the same time that we were criticizing what was going on in Peru, we looked the other way, or as one government official said, a spokesperson said, well, they're just following their traditions. So that's okay. So there's going to have to be a real shift in the way that we think about Islamist movements so that we really look at them not only in their diversity, extreme and not extreme, but look at them in every political context. One can talk about Islamically influenced governments, let's say in Turkey, Tunisia, or in Egypt, but there's a tremendous diversity in terms of how they translate their ideology and how they would implement their ideology. All right, I'm almost done. Okay. Okay, I'll skip that. Okay, all right. All right, the real power, let's say, of the U.S. and the EU is in their ability to not simply construct a new narrative, but also act on that narrative. That is, to construct a new narrative that really does emphasize self-determination, government accountability, rule of law, human rights, but implement it in terms of policies and actions. To the extent that we don't do it, we're falling back into what Ambassador Haas, who when he was in government, as well as Powell, talked about the recognition that all American governments up to Bush 43, and even Bush 43 in his first term, practiced democratic exceptionalism. And of course, when we then moved away from that, it was when we didn't find weapons of mass destruction, and so democracy became the rationale, but that's another point. Okay, equally important is to avoid what we're now doing, which is retreating to that old narrative and a conventional wisdom. That means that our best choices are securitized states. What that continues to do is look short-term rather than long-term. If we do that, it undermines not just our credibility in a broader region among the mainstream, because remember, in major polling, one thing that you did see in major polling also is that while majorities wanted to see democratization, majorities believed that, A, there was not only a double standard, but that part of that double standard was that the U.S. would not allow a government to come in that it didn't approve of. And you remember Bremer's statement, Ambassador Bremer in Iraq, when there was an issue about law, he said it's not law until I say it's law. I mean, that just reflects that. Also the language that is now still used, which is, and you see it not only used by governments, but even in popular parlance. I don't know whether this happens in Britain, but throughout my career in the US, people will often, even well-meaning people, will raise their hand and say, should we allow that country to do this? Should we allow? That immediately means there's a power situation here, or other ways in which we talk. Okay, Now, with regard to Islamic movements, I want to move to a comment about what Islamic movements need to do, and then I'll bring this to an end. I give advice to everybody on how to run their life. Okay, all right. Short-term securitization obviously is not going to lead to political stability, but with regard to the future of political Islam, it's tied to several factors. The future or lack of democratization and good governance is an issue, not just in terms of the governance, but in terms of how Islamists, both in their ideologies, when they go to get concrete, project themselves, but also how they act in power. And as I said earlier this morning, if you look at Tunisia, you will see an example which is different than Turkey or in Egypt, but what you will see in Tunisia is a movement that did recognize that the most important thing was national unity, to the point of actually giving up power and actually then constructing an environment in which they could actually suffer the kind of defeat that they did, you know, by not listening to even segments within Ennahda as well as some segments in the population of saying, look, in like this major election for a number of years, you shouldn't have, as it were, members of the deep state able to run. The question is whether or not the ability of Islamic movements to build on but not simply cling to the past and thus transform not only their organizations, organizationally, but their ideologies to respond more effectively to the realities of the 21st century. I think one of the great ironies is that if you look at the Ikhwan in Egypt, one can almost understand the problems that they had. If you function for decades in an authoritarian regime where you're always having to worry about your security, where you feel like you're under siege, and where you don't see a possibility you're going to come to power, that's what you're functioning on. The irony is that when Ennahda had to leave and everybody thought that it wasn't going to come back, you know, given the realities, what did that mean? Many of the people in exile actually learned and grew. If you look at Rashid Ghanouchi's thought over time, if you read Azam Tamimi's book, which was published a number of years ago, and others, you said, right, I get 10% of royalties? Okay. And more recent books, you will see that Ghanouchi grew. And so a lot of critical issues, you know, people will say, well, Ennahda is an Islamist movement, and then they will define it in terms of another movement, or they'll even define it in terms of something that Ghanouchi may have said 20 years ago, rather than looking at what's happening. So we have examples of the ability to make that movement. The challenge for the Ikhwan, and even for Ennahda and others, is what's the next generation? You know, with Ennahda, it's a bit like the Brotherhood in terms of Hassan al-Banna. When you have a charismatic leader, what do you do after that to succeed? If you don't have just another charismatic leader coming in. But also for these movements, what does it mean vis-a-vis the next generation? That younger generation. And not just really bringing them in and moving away from the tendency that some of us in the older generation, and here I do not include myself, even though I've been director of my center for 23 years, but I am stepping down. But the reality of it is the older generation still stays in power, and so when it goes to empower the younger generation, and you could see some of that even in the difference between the FJP and the senior, the older, it's always to be subordinated to and to represent, and not to be listening enough when you're actually beginning to talk about, and you've got a younger generation that's saying things have to change. But rather than see, no, you don't understand. You know, we've got the paradigm, this is what we stand for, and also you don't understand if we change things too much. So there are going to be, within the movement, there are going to be issues about reorganization, issues about questions of power, issues about redefining ideology. For many, this will require a rigorous process of self-criticism and transformation. Without that, these movements will be weak. But my final comment is, it doesn't, and it would come out the wrong way, regardless of whether or not movements that have existed for years prove powerful or are set aside, and regardless of whether or not they are set aside, the role of religion in politics and society for the foreseeable future in most Muslim countries, based on where majorities of Muslims are coming from, and here I'm not saying that majorities of Muslims want to see Islamist movements, but in terms of people's attitudes about the role of religious values in their society, etc. The role of religion will always be there, and so as even authoritarian rulers know who are more secularly oriented, they have to be sensitive and responsive. That also means that that critique will always exist within society. Religion will have to be part of the society. And finally, what we all have to realize is that there are multiple modernities. If you don't recognize that, we're going no place. Multiple modernities means that there isn't one single definition of what it means to be a democracy. And today, I've heard people use phrases like, well, will they ever be able to measure up to not just Western democracy, but just democracy? It's like, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Democracy is some sort of understandable universal that everybody knows. I have been writing, and many people have written for years, and talked about secularism versus religion, and the West and its secularism. The fact is, it's a multi-approach to secularism. American secularism is not what European secularism was. And our system is separation of church and state. Not necessarily politics and religion, but separation of church and state. And yet in many countries of Europe where you've had secularism, the head of the country needed to belong to the religion, or the state would support religious institutions. You have some countries where even if you say that you're no longer practicing, in one country I know in Northern Europe, you still have to pay a certain tax. It's sort of like if you're born into the faith, even if you say you want to, get out of the faith, oh my God, stuff like that sometimes happens in a Muslim country, and we think that that's arcane. You were born Muslim, well, you're always going to have to pay the tax. Or you can't convert, or you can't, So we have got to accept the fact that there are going to be multiple modernities, and what that means is that countries will be very different in the role that they will see culture and religion playing out. And that's why you can have the example, and we'll put aside what Turkey is like right now and not get into any debates about whether or not it's become more authoritarian, but just in terms of the model, that's why you could have people who were seen even after they were elected, and even after they said, well, we're no longer formally like an Islamist group, et cetera, but we're seen as Islamically oriented, accepting Turkish secularism, okay? But redefining that secularism simply in terms of saying we accept it in terms of the institutions of state, but we also believe that that secularism means that it needs to be more inclusive. And that their vision will differ from an Ennahda, which can talk about a kind of civil or civic Islam, and it will differ from someplace else. But we have to recognize those multiple modernities. Otherwise, when we do see religion playing a factor, A, we'll think it's a problem, and B, we will, if we're not careful, line up on the wrong side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that you all agree that we could listen to John for a very, very long time. And it's, once again, John Esposito, as well as Professor Yassin Akhtai and his team, who've traveled from afar to be with us today, has been indeed a highlight of this particular conference. I realize that we're running slightly late. However, just a few notes. First of all, I would like to thank everyone who's taken part in this conference. I'd like to thank each and every one of the delegates, and as well as the speakers and the moderators, everyone who's been part of making the conference the success it was. And to be perfectly honest, this conference wouldn't have happened had it not been for the hotel staff. And may I mention Rosina, who's here, and her staff, who've actually shown quite incredible leadership in the face of difficulties that they've faced as a result of the conference. So our gratitude and thanks goes to you, Rosina, and to your staff. Thank you very, very much for what you've done today. The proceedings, the recordings, many of the pictures that have been taken throughout the day will be on the Cordoba Foundation website in a couple of days' time. Look it up. It's www.thecordobafoundation.com. Hopefully we will try within the next few weeks to come up with certain papers, essays, articles, as well as we will try to reproduce some of the presentations that were made today so that basically we can carry on the discussion. Most of you have come back with the remark that the best thing about today was the fact that we had a discussion. Sadly, we are seemingly approaching a time and a place where it's no longer possible to have a discussion on this particular theme, opening it up in the way that we have throughout the day, having the kind of speakers that we've been blessed with, and getting to the depths that we've managed to do. Unfortunately, today, the narrative is extremely superficial. The discussion barely touches, not even scratches, touches the surface, and we're none the wiser. And that is part of the problem that we tried to address in the conference today. It wasn't about coming up with a final statement that everyone signs up to. It wasn't about coming out with a consensus or an agreement on a certain set of principles or ideas. It was about having the discussion and maybe even coming up with even more questions that we carry on and try to address in the future. It leaves me with nothing more but to say thank you. Have a safe journey wherever you've come from. God bless, and thank you for your contribution. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.